I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, following the usual military and political updates in this major week, we talk to two of the most high-profile analysts of the war about their new report into rectifying systemic failures in Western analysis and how vital that is for preventing future conflict.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Thursday, 26th of September, 2 years and 220 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, our Senior Foreign Correspondent, Roland Oliphant, and dialing in from Washington, D.C., Eliot A. Cohen, a former Counsellor of the US Department of State and Chair in Strategy at the Centre for International Studies, alongside Phillips O'Brien, Professor of Strategic Studies at St Andrews and Head of its School of International Relations. But before we dive into what proves to be a fascinating discussion, we begin, as ever, with Dom and the latest from the battlefront.
So there have been explosions this morning in Kyiv just in the last couple of hours. It's thought at least 2 missiles were launched. No casualties or damage reported as of a few minutes ago when I came in for the pod. Ukraine's Air Force said Russia had used a MiG-31K aircraft. Now that can carry Kinzhal ballistic missiles, but it's not been reported if such missiles were used in this attack. It's still quite new, the news coming in there. However, overnight, more than 15 drones were seen near the city of Kyiv and the wider oblast. About 10 of them brought down by air defences, the Kyiv City Military Administration said. No casualties reported from them. The air raid alarm in the capital sounded for 5 hours last night. This is happening night after night after night. So I don't mean to downplay any of the casualties, but I've said before I'm surprised that there are so few. Surprised and delighted so few. But imagine that, months after months of your night being disrupted up to 5 hours and often longer because of the air raid alerts. Last night, 66 out of 78 Shahed-type drones and 4 Kh-59/69 variant cruise missiles were shot down across the whole country. A small number of other drones were rendered ineffective by electronic warfare, and at least one turned and headed back into Russia. No reports what happened to that one. Elsewhere on the ground, Ukrainian forces are slowly closing the Vovchansk salient. So that's the area north of Kharkiv in the northeast of the country. That was the lodgement Russia pushed across the border, about 8 weeks ago now. Never really did much, didn't expand, didn't have a great effect, and wasn't able to have a greater effect on the city of Kharkiv than had been in effect already. Ukraine has been slowly closing that salient, and in the last 24 hours have made a couple of further advances there. In the Donbass, Russian forces made no further forward movements directly towards Pokrovsk. However, they have continued to expand the left flank of that bulge. So from Donetsk city going northwest towards Pokrovsk, the left flank, the left-hand side, the sort of southwest edge of that push continues to creep towards the southwest. Ukraine could very easily be caught out in an encirclement there. So I haven't seen any evidence, but I would not be surprised if they are slowly trying to make a tactical withdrawal. That might account for some of the continued advances there on their left flank, on Russia's left flank. Elsewhere, Russian forces are thought to be continuing to advance into eastern Vuhledar, the city about 20 km further south or to the southwest. Now, the big news today is the ongoing visit by President Zelensky to the United States. He's going to visit the White House later today to present his plan for victory, as it's called, to President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris. In the last hour, Joe Biden has announced a raft of new military support for Ukraine, including long-awaited glide bombs. Responding to that in a statement on Twitter, President Zelensky said he's grateful to the US for its $7.9 billion, big B billion dollar pledge that includes an additional Patriot air defence battery and missiles and lots of other military capabilities. So President Zelensky said, "We will use this assistance in the most effective and transparent way possible to achieve our main common goal, a victorious Ukraine, a just and lasting peace and transatlantic security." He said Ukraine and the United States remain close allies, dedicated to defending freedom, blah, blah, blah. You'll find all these comments that they're doing the rounds on the news. He said, "We've always valued the strong bipartisan support in the United States and among Americans for Ukraine's just cause of defeating Russian aggression." So, said everything that you would hope and expect. However, the big thing that was missing or was noticeably absent was the policy permissions to go with these new munitions. Anyway, now we know President Biden's been trying to get $5.8 billion of military funding for Ukraine through Congress by the end of September. We think the announcement today includes a further $2.4 billion under the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. But ahead of and separate to that, last night the US authorized a new military aid package for Ukraine worth $375 million. That includes air-to-ground weapons, HIMARS munitions, 155 and 105 mil artillery ammunition, armoured vehicles, anti-tank weapons, and other bits and pieces. Sounds very glib, say bits and pieces. It's all vital military equipment, but there's a long list. Now, that assistance came from the Presidential Drawdown Authority, also included for the first time the Joint Standoff Weapon. That's a medium-range glide bomb that can be operated from F-16 jets, range of about 130 Ks, 80 miles, something like that. So, a very capable munition. But, as I said, money. But I think it was either all going to happen anyway, the 7.9 billion, or it has gone through perhaps quicker than some people were expecting. To obscure might be too strong a word, but to take the attention away from the fact that there's been no movement on the weapons permissions. But that is my view only. Now, one final one for me, Francis. In Russia, Putin said he yesterday had made some, in his words, clarifications regarding necessary preconditions for Russia to use a nuclear weapon. Obviously, this is all in the context of these policy permissions and Ukraine's request to use Western munitions further into Russia. So Putin was speaking at the Russian Security Council's conference on nuclear deterrence. He said the Kremlin will consider using nuclear weapons in the case of, quote, aggression against Russia by a non-nuclear state with support or participation from a nuclear state, or in the case of the receipt of reliable information about the massive launch of air and space weapons against Russia. I mean, this is yet more tired, unimaginative attempts to bully and scare the West. It is another attempt to get the West to self-deter, in my view. He's playing the old Soviet idea of reflexive control. We spoke about that some weeks ago, a form of psychological manipulation. I know our guest, Professor Phillips O'Brien, will have a view on that. Now, responding, I don't mean to be glib about the use of nuclear weapons and nuclear escalation, but it's just schoolyard tactics. It's so boring to see them still going out with this, and even more boring to see that we sort of buy it. Now, I don't normally refer to anonymous social media users, but I'll make an exception for a tweet this morning by a site called Darth Putin. It's quite amusing to see some of their tweets. They offer spoof comments in the guise of Vladimir Putin, and they said, "The best bluff I make is not that I will use nukes, it is that there is some way to appease me that will take my nukes off the table," when all it does is reinforce the value of the bluff. I think we just need to keep that in mind. The more Putin rattles the nuclear saber, and it's not often him, he often leaves it to his lieutenants, Medvedev and Peskov and all these kind of characters. So the fact it's him, we should take notice of that, but it is the same old message. It's the same bully boy tactics. I just think we need to have a much more serious discussion about calling this kind of bluff and exposing these red lines for the invisible ink they're written with. But anyway, that's us quickly up to date, Francis.
Well, thank you very much, Dom. Before we go to our special guests today, Roland, you've been monitoring the latest political developments over the last 24 hours. As Dom mentioned there, lots going on in the United States around the UN General Assembly. Where do you want to start?
Where do I want to start? Let me just start with just a few thoughts on the nuclear update, because I think it reflects everything else. That, as Dom mentioned, that announcement by Vladimir Putin of a proposed change to Russia's nuclear doctrine, it's not yet a change. It's kind of, he's presenting it on a televised meeting of the Security Council, is very clearly a response to the very public debate that Dom also referred to there about whether or not the United States and other Western allies should grant Ukraine's request to permission to use long-range Western weapons in strikes inside Russia beyond the immediate border where they're allowed to at the moment. It's absolutely clear that that's what it's connected to. It's part of the dance. When you speak to people who specialize in this kind of thing, kind of looking at how Russia uses this, there's two things to keep in mind. One is that they have a very long history of using the nuclear threat. Say play the nuclear card, really, because it doesn't even have to be an explicit threat. It's a way of kind of creating diplomatic space, and they've done it since well before this war. So it's a well-tested Russian diplomatic political technique to get there. And then you have the levels of it. And when you speak to people who deal with this stuff really seriously and look at it, they say, look, nuclear weapons are not a joking matter, so you don't just laugh it off. But at the bottom of the escalation ladder, there's Dmitry Medvedev having one vodka too many and writing something on Telegram about reducing the United States to radioactive ash or something. And then, you go up the ladder. The point people really worry about when they say we should take it seriously is when you start seeing the Russians actually doing things like taking warheads out of storage, fueling rockets, mating warheads to delivery systems, things like that. That's when these people say, that's when you got up and stay noticed. This particular intervention, it comes from Vladimir Putin. It is talking about an official adjustment of the nuclear doctrine. Therefore, it is definitely a step above some random lunatic on state TV. But we're definitely nowhere near that point of actually thinking that nuclear use is imminent. So just kind of echoing Dom's analysis there, really. In terms of the UN General Assembly, as you said, big week. Zelensky's there to basically talk to Joe Biden, as Dom was saying today. Just after we came off air yesterday, Zelensky had his turn at the United Nations General Assembly, addressing other world leaders. He made some interesting points. He warned Russia has destroyed all of Ukraine's thermal power plants, all of them, nearly all of its hydroelectricity, and said it had plans to strike 3 remaining nuclear power plants under Ukrainian control, remembering that the 4th one, Zaporizhzhia, is under Russian control, to disconnect from the grid. He talked about raising the danger of a new Chernobyl. That's not new. He said that in a speech to the UN Security Council as well. But then he took a swipe, quite a deliberate swipe, at specifically Brazil and China over their alternative 6-point peace document, which they've been pushing this year. Brazil's President Lula da Silva mentioned this in his own speech to the General Assembly. Mr. Zelensky said, look, I've got this 10-point peace plan that I published in late 2022. If you want an alternative to that, that's probably because you don't actually want peace, was basically his message. Here's the quote: the peace formula has already existed for 2 years, and maybe somebody wants a Nobel Prize for their political biography for a frozen truce instead of real peace. But the only prizes Putin will give you in return are more suffering and disasters. Alternatives, half-hearted settlement plans, so-called sets of principles, that is a reference to the Chinese-Brazilian proposals, would just give Putin the political space to continue the war. And he did name them. When the Chinese-Brazilian duo tries to grow into a choir of voices, with someone in Europe, with someone in Africa, saying something alternative to a full and just peace, the question arises, what is their true interest? Everyone must understand you will not boost your power at Ukraine's expense. That reference to Africa, that reference to the Global South, again, we talked about that yesterday with David Lammy's remarks, this acknowledgement that there is a diplomatic struggle on for the sympathies of, it's a clunky term, but let's say the Global South, the unaligned world, which is very, very much ongoing. Big event today is, of course, Zelensky meeting Biden and Kamala Harris. I just wanted to add one other thing on that. It's an extremely fraught domestic American political atmosphere that he's getting into there. It's much, much more difficult than it has been before. House Speaker Mike Johnson, who said he'll be too busy to meet Zelensky. Then he accused Zelensky of indulging in partisan politics when he went to Scranton, Pennsylvania on Tuesday, because no Republicans were invited. And then, of course, we know that President Zelensky wanted to speak to Donald Trump. Donald Trump's people have said, no, that's not going to happen. So it seems like the Ukrainian attempt to walk that tightrope in the incredibly polarized atmosphere of current American politics is running a little bit into trouble. He's probably not going to get that meeting with Trump at the moment. That is, I think, where the diplomatic political kind of game is at.
Well, thank you very much, Roland, for that. Now, we're delighted to be sharing the airwaves today with Professors Eliot Cohen and Phillips O'Brien, two of the most distinguished commentators on the war. They've just co-authored a report published this week reviewing 181 pieces of research and analysis from think tanks, media outlets and other sources to comprehensively examine the flawed pre-war assessments of the Russia-Ukraine military balance. It's the most important assessment so far of those errors, designed, as the historian Sir Hugh Strawn writes in the foreword, to mitigate dangers of analysis around a possible future clash from the United States and between the United States and the People's Republic of China in the Pacific. Eliot, welcome back. Always a pleasure to have you on Ukraine the Latest. Take us back in time, then, to those early weeks of 2022. What were experts predicting regarding this war, and why, in your view, did they get it so wrong?
Well, first, thank you for having me. And I do want to begin by just expressing my condolences with that of so many other people on the passing of David Knowles. I only met him that one time when you were in Washington. After listening to him over years now, I really had a sense of a wise, gentle, and inquisitive soul. And good on you for continuing the way that I'm sure he would have wanted you to. So to get to the assessments at the beginning of the war, I think it's really, you have to go back, and it's quite stunning, actually, when you review it, the extent to which people assumed that not only that the Russians would win the war, but that they would win it within a matter of weeks, if not days. That within days they would be in Kyiv, that within 2 weeks, and of course this was the Russian view as well, they would have occupied as much of the country as they wished to. And one of the things that struck both Phil and myself was the extent to which these judgments were not qualified. They weren't, well, we think this is possible. We think it could turn out this way. There was an enormous amount of certainty behind it. So why did people make those errors? A number of reasons, I think. One of which is that most of the analyses were being done within a relatively small community of Russia military analysts who describe themselves that way, undiluted with military historians or historians of Ukraine, or even people who had spent time in Ukraine with Ukrainian forces. And I think subconsciously, many of them absorbed first Russia's view of Ukraine as kind of a lesser included case of Russia. And I think there was also a tendency towards what our friend Hugh Strawn describes in the foreword as military balance analysis. We all use the military balance, which is put out by the International Institute for Strategic Studies, this massive tome that comes out every year, it's a tremendous resource, has everything you might want to know about who has what kinds of equipment and the structure of their active forces, the reserve forces, command structures, and so forth. But, both Phil and I are military historians, and one of the things that really struck us is they weren't looking at the things that frequently mattered just as much or even more in war, like morale, like discipline, like corruption in the case of the Russian military. And there was a tendency to accept at face value the Russian military's self-assessment as a much, much better army than anybody had any reason to think it was.
Well, let's stay on that theme then, because it's very interesting you talk in the report about the intelligence failures on the Russian army specifically, and some of the assumptions that were built into it, in this belief in the professionality of the Russian armed forces versus, say, civilian armies like the Ukrainians. How do you account for that when the intelligence services were able to predict accurately that it was likely, at least in the United States, I should say, accurately that Putin was likely to invade, but get it so wrong with the next steps around military analysis and army preparedness from the Russian side?
Well, first, I would just say that you're correct in talking about the intelligence assessments. I think one of the things that's disturbing to us is, even though we worked solely with unclassified material, there are plenty of indications that the intelligence community made exactly the same kinds of mistakes. And that's not entirely surprising. The analytic communities outside and inside are really rather tightly linked. There are many different kinds of intelligence. One, which you just referenced, is what is sometimes called warning and indicators. That is, are they about to attack? It's the sort of Pearl Harbor style intelligence, if you will, the things that you wish you had. We know that they're going to attack. We know they're going to attack with certain kinds of forces. In a way, that's a lot easier because it was very possible to track the Russian buildup, to not only to detect the movement of forces, but people setting up communications networks and doing all the other things that you do to prepare military operations. Those are very easy to observe. The actual performance of armed forces during war is a very, very different matter and requires a very different kind of analysis. Now, as to why these misjudgments were made, we offer a number in the report, one of which is mirror imaging. That is to say, and this wasn't simply an American fault, although Americans were probably worse than most at it, but I think most European analyses, except in the Baltic states, were this way as well. We ended up discussing the Russian military as if it were a somewhat inferior version of the United States military. So, for example, the temptation to talk about the Russian army as a professional force. Well, no, it wasn't a professional force. You had contract soldiers who were technically not conscripts, although many of them had been coerced or bribed into signing up for an additional year of military service. That's not the same thing as the kind of professional army that the United States or Great Britain have with, for example, a very strong non-commissioned officer corps, which is, I'm sure Dom or Hamish, Brett, and Gordon would tell us, is really the backbone of any seriously professional army. So there was mirror imaging there. There was also mirror imaging in, I'll just mention one other quite significant way, and that is the use of the term shock and awe. It's actually a title of a particularly egregious article in Foreign Affairs, that Russia will conduct a shock and awe operation. Now, that's a bad phrase even for us, I think, and I kind of flinched at the use of it before the Iraq War, but it conveys the impression that you can launch this devastating blow from the air, which will, paralyze all your air defenses, destroy your air force, paralyze your command and control. And it turns out, of course, the Russian Air Force wasn't capable of anything remotely like that. They still struggle with what the military sometimes calls dynamic targeting. That is to say, the ability to see a fleeting target that's moving like a train or something and to call down fire on it. So this tendency to mirror image, and I'll add just one more thing. The tendency people had to loosely use terms like battle-hardened or battle-tested. Again, the most egregious case is people talking about the Russian military in Syria as a battle-tested or battle-hardened or experienced armed forces. Well, not really. In Syria, what they were doing is they were mainly killing civilians in a completely benign air environment where you could drop bombs on people who couldn't shoot back at you. And that was, of course, not the case when you're looking at Ukraine. There are others, but that's at least a start.
One final question, Eliot, before we bring in Phillips. One of the striking things in the report is you're quite critical, both of you, about counterfactual history and how it's being used to conceal errors of analysis, if I can articulate it as such. Just wondered if you get a little bit more into that as a topic.
Sure. So one of a wonderful book on this subject is by a psychologist named Philip Tetlock. And the book is called Expert Political Judgment. And it's a study of why political prognosticators usually get their predictions wrong, and in fact, in ways that do worse than the proverbial chimpanzee throwing darts at the proverbial dartboard. And one of the things that he goes into are what are the different explanations that when people get it wrong, they give for having gotten it wrong. And one of them is the I was almost right defense. So the I was almost right defense is, if only one battle had gone the other way, everything might have been turned around. It's like that old rhyme about for the want of a horseshoe nail, the battle was lost. In this case, it's, well, if they had gotten into Hostomel, if they hadn't run into unexpected resistance, they'd gotten there a day earlier, they would have gotten into Kyiv, it would have been game over. But of course, that didn't happen. There might be a reason why the Ukrainians had forces at Hostomel, even if they had gotten in there, and let's say they do manage to somehow drive into Kyiv. Well, look what happened in Mariupol. Why would you think that quite a small Russian force wouldn't be swallowed up by Kyiv and defeated by it? And there are a lot of those kinds of very close counterfactuals, which I think they really do fall apart. Other kinds of counterfactuals as well. There was exogenous shock, something you couldn't have predicted, like the West providing intelligence assistance to the Ukrainians. Well, except this was pretty clearly known before the war, that we were actually spilling a lot of intelligence. So that, I think, doesn't hold up particularly well. Or that Vladimir Putin, the fault is all of Vladimir Putin for having taken over the operation, and in particular blaming the FSB. And if the FSB hadn't run the operation, the Russian General Staff would have conducted it brilliantly. But we don't know that actually the Russian General Staff wanted to conduct it any differently than they did. And there were so many failures on the Russian side, which are not the fault of the FSB, having to do with logistics, having to do with tactics, simply how they move down roads, that falls apart too. What so strikes us in this is that instead of confronting what was really a large analytic failure, there is frequently a temptation to make excuses for it. And that's just bad business. That's, I think, as academics of a certain type, we believe, if somebody catches you in having gotten a source wrong, you acknowledge it, and then you move on. But that really hasn't happened very much.
So, Phil, when we're talking about history and reflecting on the way in which history has been used and misused during this war, what would you like to add to that?
Well, I mean, in some sense, history wasn't used. And I think that was one of the more problematic aspects of the analysis, is that war was presented in a way which had very few historical parallels beyond, as was said, the U.S. 1990s comparison, I suppose. And Hugh Strawn actually goes through a lot of that in the introduction to our paper, that this war was a short war. Many wars are assumed that they're going to be short when they start, but they hardly ever took out that way. Things like terrain were not discussed. Weather. I mean, this was a full-scale invasion to begin in Ukraine at the end of February, which this is a large country. And anyone who knows the weather and the topography would say, well, that has to be taken into consideration. But it really didn't seem to be. So it was just historically, what was odd is that there wasn't much history, I would say. And there was the assumption that the Russian military could simply fulfill its tasks regardless of when and where it was going to be. So hopefully what we can get out of this report is that people might reflect more on history when they make military analyses.
Thank you, and great to have you with us, Phil. It's really always a pleasure to read your work, and I know many of our listeners will have followed you as closely as we have since the beginning of the war. Just staying on this briefly before bringing in Dom and Roland. You talk in the paper, and Hugh Strawn does, about the First World War, which is often being talked about in the context of the war in Ukraine. And you say in the report, when taken as a whole, that the First World War analogy played badly in the US for three reasons. I just wonder if you could go a little bit into ways in which you think that the conversation around the First World War was unhelpful in the US and was accurate and both inaccurate.
Well, I mean, the inaccurate was the view, I think, that we were getting into a First World War kind of environment. This was, I think, when we're talking about 2023 in particular, which people were saying, okay, we are now in a First World War kind of environment. And the entire U.S. military's outlook is never to fight the First World War. The U.S. military wants to be fast-moving, hard-hitting, combined arms war. By the way, the kind of thing the Russians can't do, and really the Ukrainians can't do at this time either. So the entire U.S. military outlook is to rebel against a First World War kind of discussion and to try and fight in a completely new kind of condition. However, I think what we've seen here is that there are elements of the First World War, because of technology and because of the way these armed forces interact, that we cannot escape. And that really came out last summer when Ukraine was asked to do a combined arms offensive against a prepared defensive line in trenches without air superiority. And the US Army was sort of pushing it to do something that it really could not do, considering the conditions.
Thank you very much. And Eliot, just wonder, before we go to Dom and Rome, whether you've got any other further thoughts on this?
I think to the extent history has shaped how we think about this war, one of the ways in which it has shaped it is looming over all of us has been a certain kind of memory of the Second World War. And Phil is, as you know, a very distinguished historian of the Second World War. And it has conjured up images of the Red Army as this vast behemoth which could just crush everything in its way. The Russian military, as of 2022, was a fraction the size of what it had been in World War II. They lose over 1 million troops just in the initial battles in June of 1941, and they can keep on going because they have millions more. That was not the Russian army. It was about 175,000 troops, maybe, all around the Ukrainian periphery. A total military, not just army, of about 900,000. And a lot of other parts of the comparison fall apart, to include just the level of corruption, the quality of officership, and so forth. And I think, unfortunately, that's exercised a very kind of pernicious influence on how we think about the war, and it accounts for some of the defeatism that about Ukraine's prospects. The other piece of history that I think is really quite important is the pervasive ignorance of Ukrainian history. Tim Snyder, who I know the podcast is a big fan of, as am I, once pointed out there are only a couple of courses taught on Ukrainian history in the United States. And I think if you were to ask most people about Ukraine, they say, well, it's really basically not really a country. It's essentially a sort of a variant of Russia. And that also had a profoundly distorting effect. So, history always creeps in by the back door, and unfortunately, it's usually bad history.
Fascinating. Thank you. Now, just before we look at the lessons, I'm going to bring in Dom and Roland here, because there are some important lessons you do talk about in the report. But I think let's get a little bit more into some of the granular military stuff. Dom Nicholls. Yeah, thanks, Francis. And Eliot, Phil, delighted to have you on. Thank you so much for joining. Eliot, it doesn't seem like a year ago that we were together in Washington with our great pal, David. Seems just like yesterday. But thank you so much for joining us today. Now, in your report, you make it very clear that you've not found any deliberate dishonesty or manipulation from the analytic community, just that they got it wrong. Poor analysis for the reasons that you outline in the document. What do you think is wrong with the structure of the analytic community as it stands today? And what might a more healthy community look like that is able to hold contrary positions without damage to professional reputations?
I can begin that, and Phil, I know will have views. I think the first thing is this is a small analytic community. After the Cold War, the community shrunk. There are still some people left from the old Cold War community that used to analyze the Russians, and there's some very, very good people. So there was, for example, something called the Soviet Studies Research Center at Sandhurst, which did really excellent, thoughtful, open source work. So it became small and enclosed. I think part of what we're seeing is the dominance of the think tank world, which I'm part of it now, so I'm not criticizing it overall, but it's a world in which, and in this community in particular, nobody was incentivized to be critical and to really have sharp disagreements with leading figures. Instead, there tended to be a lot of groupthink, a lot of consensus, a lot of mutual citation. And the incentives frequently in communities like that are to do that. Now, I can complain a lot about being the academic world, and I do, being a former dean. But at its best, it incentivizes sharp disagreement. And that I think was not the case here. I'll also say one other thing and then pass it off to Phil. I did find myself thinking during this about COVID and the extent to which public health experts who had a lot of knowledge projected much more self-confidence than they had any reason to about the truth of their judgments. And so that was one huge problem. The other huge problem is they didn't bring in other kinds of experts or generalists. So the case with COVID, I would say, is if you're going to close down all the schools, could you at least bring in some child psychologists to talk about what are the risks associated with that? I mean, I to be very clear, we don't believe in junking expertise, far from it. But it's also important to bring in many kinds of expertise and to bring in generalists as well. And that didn't happen here.
Yeah, if I could just sort of hop in, it's been a fascinating experience for me because coming from the academic world and delving into the think tank world, it has an entirely different incentive system than the academic world. In the academic world, once you're at least tenured or you're permanent, you can do the research you kind of wish to do and get on with it. And in fact, many academics don't look for any kind of public statements. The think tank world tends to prioritize, at least into the public sphere, the clear, short, snappy analysis. And this, I would say, became an increasing problem as you had the run-up to the full-scale invasion in February, that many of the most dramatic statements were made in the few months before. That Russia will devastate or could devastate the Ukrainian military in less than an hour, and that the war would be functionally over in a day or two. These are the kinds of things that almost the community was building up to. And I think it was partly incentivized by the idea that the press wanted these kinds of statements. They wanted the kind of clarity. So the think tank system is not good for the expression of doubt. That if you're going to pay for the outside for research, be it if you're going to pay from the Pentagon or you're paying from a wealthy donor, it doesn't seem that doubt is something you want a great deal of in that analysis, or at least the assumption that it could be something quite different than the analyst was thinking. So I think it is important if you could find a way in future research to bring the best of the university in with the best of the think tanks. That would be incredibly positive, because right now the incentive system does not tend itself, I think, towards reflection.
And just to be clear, I think both Phil and I could give you a very dark view of the academic world. It's just a different set of perversities. And I think we would both agree that, unfortunately, with very few exceptions, I hope we're two of them, the academic world hasn't had nearly enough to say about this war.
I mean, the point about the press, I think, is very well made. I've said it before. Michelle, you're going to like this. The tickets for the ghost train sell out quicker than the tickets for the speak your weight machine. Borrowed that from James O'Brien.
What machine?
I'll tell you later, Roland. Don't worry. But gentlemen, it wasn't just the Western analytic community that got it wrong. Russia got it badly wrong as well, self-evidently. So are there any parallels at all into their analytic community or their setup in the Kremlin that might explain how they came to a very different conclusion? Or are there areas of hope? And I've said before, if the word hope enters your plan, you haven't planned enough. But areas of hope that their system is not reflective enough to see the flaws and therefore are not going to put truth up the chain.
I mean, I can start this one off for you, Eliot. I mean, if the Russian system seemed to prioritize what Putin wanted. So I would use the Russian system not as a superb example of what research should be or analysis should be, because clearly the head of state, the dictator, wanted to go through with this invasion and would probably not have accepted any analysis which said it wasn't going to work. It was a bit like the Japanese Navy going into Midway, where they ran a war game, the Japanese Navy was sunk, and they said, well, that's not good. We still want to do Midway, so let's rerun the war game and win. And they did, and they said, great, now we can do Midway. So, I mean, the fact that we would say that the Russians got it wrong is probably a reflection on their system. What I think is more interesting is the Ukrainians. And I have heard people say, well, the Ukrainians got it wrong. Well, actually, they didn't as much. I mean, I was in Ukraine 2 weeks ago. And actually, if you look at some of the reports that were made of the think tanks, they go, well, the Ukrainians are surprisingly optimistic, but we don't believe they have grounds to be such. And in Ukraine, when I was there, I was talking to people who were part of the general staff, and they said, we thought we were going to drive them back from Kyiv. And we'd mentioned that to Western analysts, and they disagreed with us. And said we had no hope, and so we stopped talking to them and expressing our optimism. So I think it would behoove us to listen to the people themselves a bit more. And also the positivity that has come out of this is that the frontline states, the Baltics, the Finns, the Poles, I think have a much better understanding of the weaknesses and strengths of the Russians than we did farther away. And those states have gone, I think, consistently higher quality analysis about the state of the war than has been done in, say, Washington, London, or Berlin.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would add, first, the Russian military system overall is riddled with falsehood, with pervasive lying up and down the chain of command. And I mean, it's hard enough to get the truth in Western militaries where there is a lot of emphasis put on telling your superiors bad news if the news really is bad. But I think the Russian system is very different. And that was one of those intangibles that didn't really get, I think, factored in. So that's one reason. But the other reason was cultural condescension. I think the Russians really did not think of the Ukrainians as, you know, an independent people. And many wars are pervaded by all kinds of cultural misapprehensions. To give you a trivial example from a war that I spent a lot of time on working for the government, the first Gulf War, one of the reasons why Saddam Hussein was rather disdainful of the United States military is he read an article in which says the Americans are distributing sunblock and lip balm to their soldiers. And of course, the way he interpreted it is they're a bunch of sissies. I mean, what kind of soldier needs sunblock and chapstick? And the answer is, you know, the kind of military that really takes a particularly good care of its soldiers. But it was outside his framework, and so he profoundly misinterpreted it. And I think most wars involve some kind of deep cultural misinterpretation, and this was one of them.
Thank you. Now, I've got loads more questions, and Phil, I'd love to ask you about reflexive control, but I've been told I've only got time for one more. So one it's going to be, but very heavily loaded. I mean, I would have loved to ask you, of all the many reasons the analytic community got it wrong, what do you think is the most easily excused by the perpetrators and therefore most likely to happen again? But I'm not going to ask that because we haven't got time. I would like to ask many things, but I will ask you, gentlemen, your paper is about how humans make mistakes for all the understandable reasons. What did you get wrong about the analysis of the war in Ukraine? And with hindsight and reflection, why do you think you came to those conclusions?
So I'll start off because I think Phil was probably closer to the money than I was. I did at the beginning expect that Ukraine would suffer a major conventional defeat. And I think that was probably because I put more credence in that some of the analytic judgments. I wasn't nearly as pessimistic as some of the others because, among other things, it was clear to me that the Ukrainians would fight. But I think I underestimated the degree of corruption and just sheer incompetence in the Russian military. I mean, I thought this was going to be a much tougher thing for them. I didn't expect anything like what we saw. And in particular, I think the thing that I did not understand about Ukraine is the extraordinary way in which it tends to self-organize, and you get a lot of bottom-up initiatives. Now, there are problems with that. And last time I was in Ukraine, we talked to, he was then Minister Commission in charge of strategic industries. He's now advising the president. He said our horizontal orientation, by which he meant that tendency to kind of self-organize and do things from the bottom up. He said, it's our national character, it's our national problem, and it's our national superpower. And I thought that what an acute assessment of one's own society. And simply because I'd never been to Ukraine before, I didn't have a feel for that. And so I think I underestimated them. I do think I had a lot more doubt about it, and B, probably most importantly, I pivoted fast. And for me, that's one of the key things. When reality doesn't conform to your impression of it, how quickly can you go, oh, I got that one wrong, and then try to do a better assessment? And there wasn't nearly enough of that here.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think. Yeah, how long a list do you want on what you get wrong? I would say, I mean, I was actually, I assumed the war was going to be a disaster. I wrote that in January of 2022. I said, this war is going to be a disaster. Ukraine is going to be fight. So in a sense, going into it, I was sort of right. What I've gotten wrong, well, primarily a few things. I think Western response. I never thought we would still be here 2.5 years later, wondering about giving Ukraine ranged weapons. I simply have underestimated how slow the U.S. would be, how they wouldn't see it as an opportunity. I assume they would see this as a great opportunity to weaken Russian strength. And I've just gotten that wrong. The West has been, I think, far more hesitant to help Ukraine. The sanctions have been weaker than they need to be. That they've been more afraid of Russian collapse than I ever thought. And in Washington, they were afraid of Russian collapse. So the Western response has been very different than I expected. I would say what Russia has done is it has generated more soldiers and be willing to have mass casualties at a higher level than I would have thought to this point. I mean, 600,000 now. If this continues by next year, it could be over 1 million. And I think maybe because I'd assumed the West would get aid to Ukraine faster at more sort of advanced quantities, I didn't think we would be in this war now. So I didn't see it being 3 years down the road with 1 million casualties because I thought they would have helped Ukraine to win the war. So I think those are the big things. The response of the West has just been absolutely baffling to me, and I just got it wrong.
Thanks. Yes, and I think that's a point that's been made by General Ben Hodges as well, one of the commentators who's been leading on the military analysis during this war. We've also interviewed him on the podcast, and he said when people put to him, why, has the war gone on this long when you said it should be much shorter? And he said, because I didn't believe that the West would be this stupid and this slow. And I think that's a valid critique, really. But Roland, you've waited extremely patiently. I'm going to bring you in now. Where do you want to start in your questions for our guests?
I feel bad kind of asking these questions because they seem a little bit trite. I think the conversation's moved so wonderfully well. But nonetheless, listen, thank you both for coming on and addressing this question, because it is a question I think everybody who kind of followed Russia and Ukraine should have been asking themselves over the past 2 years. I've asked multiple people that question, how come we got it wrong? How come you got it wrong, whoever I'm talking to? Part of it is down to the Ukrainians themselves in the following sense. First of all, that the analytic community just didn't know much about the Ukrainian military. They had all this information about the Russian military and they could talk about what it could do and so on and be studied. And they, for whatever reason, the Ukrainian military was a bit of a black box, maybe because not enough attention had been paid to it and how it had changed and so on. But also because the Ukrainians were kind of deliberately not sharing their plans with people. I'm sure, I can't quote from memory, and it's probably the kind of conversation I shouldn't quote anyway, but I'm pretty sure I've spoken to people who were kind of from Western countries going over there, talking to the Ukrainian general staff and supposedly been showing, the plans for the Battle of Kiev. And then the Battle of Kiev happened, and that clearly was not the Ukrainian plan. Do you think to a degree Ukrainian wily secrecy is one reason for analysts getting this wrong?
I don't actually accept that as an excuse. For one thing, there were quite a few people who actually had a good take on the Ukrainian military, and that were the members of the training missions that the United States, Great Britain, and Canada had there. I asked a senior intelligence official, as you were doing your estimates, and this was somebody who was quite candid that they had gotten it wrong as well. I said, did you talk to those people? I mean, this should be not that hard. American soldiers talking to the American intelligence community. So he kind of looked at his feet and said, well, that just turned out to be bureaucratically too complicated. So there's not an excuse. And I think particularly if you're going to characterize yourself as an expert. Secondly, the things about force structure, they were all there. I mean, again, I refer you to the military balance, that the Ukrainians began investing very heavily in artillery, for example. Or some of the other changes they made, those were not concealed. Are they going to give you their war plans for defending Kyiv? Well, come on. No sane officer in any military would do that. But there were other things you could track. And then finally, we have a separate chapter on the operations in the Donbass. And if you look at those, and you can read about them, by the way, in American military journals and elsewhere, actually the Ukrainians pull off some quite interesting operations. At the end of the war, they're outmatched in 2015, but they are operating and they're doing some daring things, rather like the Kursk operation in some respects. So no, I don't let them off the hook.
Yeah, I mean, when you boil it down, I think the cultural condescension, if that's the phrase we want to use, impact was real. That simply people didn't study Ukraine in the way that they should and had a lot of assumptions about it because of their view, which came from Russia first, Ukraine second. One of the shocking things in the database is of the works that were actually supposed to be about a Russia-Ukraine war, 25% of them didn't bother to analyze Ukraine at all. They mentioned the Ukraine army, but more just what the Russian army would do to it. So there was no attempt to really go into how or where Ukraine would fight or whether it could even fight. So I do think there was that view of Russia as the dominant actor, Ukraine as the secondary actor, and therefore not deserving of the amount of attention. And that in some ways, is not surprising considering people studied the Russian military for, say, the Pentagon or the UK MOD. No, they weren't commissioning reports on the Ukrainian military. They were commissioning reports on the Russian. But you do have to always then ask yourself, from what perspective are you approaching this problem? And I did hear from the Ukrainian, they simply said, people would come and tell them they were doomed. And I'm not going to hold it against them, therefore, if they don't start sharing their plans.
Yeah, and even sort of sillier things like that than that. I'm just think of how many people were saying, well, in large parts of Ukraine, they all speak Russian. So obviously they're going to go along with the Russian occupation. Well, one may recall that there was this unpleasantness in the United States between 1861 and 1865. And at least nominally, both people in the South and people in the North spoke the same language. And somehow it didn't kind of work out that, we all reconciled rather easily.
That is an extraordinary observation. Thank you to both. I think I'll take that as I'll put a tick in the that's just an excuse box next to that question. But you've kind of touched on the role of the media, and this question, this discussion has largely been about the role of kind of what the military analytic community got wrong in that, predicting a total Russian victory and not grasping, that Ukraine would fight and so on. But I was wondering if you've thought about the other community, I suppose the community that I'm kind of a part of, the political watchers, the Russia watchers, the people who've spent years and years kind of embroiled in thinking they understand Vladimir Putin's mind, almost all of whom, including me, just didn't think he would do this. I think we can almost flip it around. We could say that a lot of those people, I would say, I was completely wrong in thinking that Russia would launch the war, but I kind of knew Ukraine was going to fight. Right? I can kind of say I didn't think they'd do it because it was because it seemed so crazy, because I knew Ukraine would fight and therefore it would be a more difficult war. But nonetheless, there was a real catastrophic kind of failure to understand there as well. And I was wondering if you have any views on that.
So I would say this, in my experience, journalists are very skeptical about politicians, frequently skeptical about military people. For some reason, a lot of them lose that skepticism when they bring on a talking head. I suppose I'm one, but particularly this kind of person. Well, so-and-so is an expert, and so they get to deliver oracular statements as opposed to saying, hang on a second, didn't you say this at the beginning? Or simply keeping track. I will say, to throw you guys a bouquet, I think Ukraine the Latest does a wonderful job of not just going back to the same experts over and over, but to all kinds of people. That's actually where I think the journalists fell down. You can't expect journalists to have expertise about everything because you end up covering lots of different things. The question is, what sort of skepticism do you exercise towards sources, particularly the kinds of sources that I think you'll frequently see on television, which seems to be a more problematic medium than others.
Yeah, and if I could simply add that, I've just written a book called The Strategists, where I say we have to actually look at the individual war leaders. We tend to look at war leaders all making rational choices as if they're all acting under the same influences. And I won't invade Ukraine, therefore you wouldn't invade Ukraine, because it's not a logical thing. But the people at the heads of states have their own very particular points of view. And that Putin
I'm no expert, as I said. I'm not a Russianist. I'm not a Putin expert. But clearly, this is something he had been preparing for years, if not decades, in a way. And there's no one logic to it. It's Putin's logic, and we need to try and look at the logic of the person making the grand strategy, as opposed to a greater rationality that we assume they have.
Well, thanks, Roland and Dom, for your questions. There's so much more that we could talk about. I wanted to ask, for instance, about other erroneous assumptions, like how the size of Ukraine proved to not be a liability for Kyiv, as many predicted, but a major defence asset, and the Western fear of getting into an attritional war, despite it actually being how most wars are ultimately won. But I think we should actually end with the structural failures of Western knowledge systems, not just universities, but also think tanks, government bureaucracies, etc. The critique one often hears is that there's no real consequence for failure, no reckoning. So one can make a totally inaccurate prediction as an organisation, and then it's maybe registered that it was wrong, but there's no real analysis afterwards, no admission of a mistake. I just wondered, with that in mind for you, what are the lessons that need to be taken from this about how we reorganise, restructure those systems for analysing war? I know that you list several in your report.
So just on the Indo-Pacific, the lessons are you need to study your own side as well as the other side, and to study it closely. And the other thing is you have to look at the intangibles. And a lot of the analysis in the Indo-Pacific is really about the things you can count, how many gray hulls the Chinese can put out there. As for the broader question, you can't, look, we're not going to convene tribunals which sentence erring experts to a year in the salt mines. That's not going to happen. It wouldn't be a good thing if it did. The most important thing you can do, though, is to find ways to set up sharp differences of opinion and to embrace them. And, at its best, the academic world is fratricidal and even parricidal. We go after each other. To the extent that journalists or the think tanks themselves or universities can help set up circumstances where people have to debate each other and disagree with each other and be confronted about their use of evidence, that shouldn't be a career-ending kind of thing. It shouldn't even be a career-damaging kind of thing. But it should be a routine sort of experience that everybody goes through.
Yeah, and I'll just quickly add, don't just look at the analysis. Spend a lot of time looking at the community making the analysis and interrogate the community. And that's communities of all sorts. That we sometimes look at the analysis as if this is the expert speaking. But really, different kinds of communities, you have to behave very differently. Are they, as Eliot said, interrogating each other? Are they willing to disagree? Often there's a hierarchy in communities, so there's one or two lead experts who no one will challenge. So force yourself to look at how the analysis is being made, not just the analysis.
That brings us on to our final thoughts then, where we just offer a few final reflections of the day. Anything else that we may not have covered? Dom, Nicholls, let's let you start.
Thanks, Francis. Just a quickie. Moscow, this was reported in the last 2 hours I saw it first on Sky News. Moscow has returned 9 children, single figure, 9 children who were deported to Russia out of the, we think at least 12,000 taken to Russia. So Maria Lvova-Belova, that's the Children's Rights Commissioner for Russia. She said the group included 8 boys aged 12 to 17 and one 17-year-old girl in this swap that was coordinated by Qatar. Ms. Lvova-Belova said representatives from Qatar had, quote, participated in negotiations with the Ukrainian side. Now, as I say, we've covered this quite extensively. Francis, in particular, has really been keeping track on this issue of the deported children, the kidnapped children. I mark it because we talk about it a lot, so there's no great conclusions from this, but 9 have been returned, and that word negotiation, Russia is now using children as negotiating tactics. I think it's extraordinary, it's disgusting, and we will not turn away from it. Thanks, Francis.
Thank you, Dom. Roland, you next, please.
Hello, I'm afraid I'm going to bang on what I always bang on about. It's still diplomatic big week. The reason Zelensky, just to bore listeners again, the reason he's in America really is to sell this victory plan. We still don't know what it is. Wait for the details, but we know it requires American buy-in, and a key element of it is security guarantees. And these are the elements that they're looking for to, as we mentioned earlier in the week, kind of move the chessboard towards an end game. It might be a very long end game, but I still think that's the critical kind of diplomatic thing to be looking at. And I still think that events on the battlefield are therefore even more critical now because of their influence in that kind of debate than at any other time. So do not look away.
Well, thank you very much. Roland, Phillips, what would you like to leave our listeners with?
Don't listen to Russian doctrinal changes on nuclear weapons and think they matter. A leader is going to fire a nuclear weapon if they want to. They're not going to fire a nuclear weapon because, my doctrine says I need to fire it now. So all this talk about nuclear weapons and doctrine is signaling. It's an attempt to try and sort of intimidate people from helping Ukraine. It is making nuclear war no more likely than it was yesterday.
Thank you very much. And Eliot, you have the final word today.
So I've been trying to follow the Middle East wars as well as the Ukraine war. And one thing that strikes me there is the role of shock, which is a phenomenon in war that can be very important. Israel experienced a strategic shock on October 7th. It inflicted an operational shock with the pager and walkie-talkie attack. What strikes me is we haven't really seen that in this war, and I find myself wondering why. It's a wide open question. Maybe the first Ukrainian counteroffensive, but it is an important phenomenon in war, and it might come back. And then finally, on a totally frivolous note, Francis and Dom, I don't understand you guys nattering on about Napoleon. I mean, shouldn't you be talking about Nelson and Wellington and Sir Sidney Smith and John Moore, not to mention Jack Aubrey and Stephen Maturin? As a faithful listener to the podcast, I'm baffled.
Thanks, Eliot. David and I would often discuss Horatio Nelson because I'm from where Nelson was born. So once you start us up, it'll be very hard to stop. That might answer your question. But thank you all very, very much for your time today. It's been really, really fascinating and important. And we'll have that link in the show notes to the report for those who wish to read it in full. It's vital on the subjects of the moment. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do please refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. As the disinformation war continues, we're relying on your support more than ever. You can get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on Twitter, now X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Nicholls.